So, without further ado, we'll be asking all of you to stand as we have an official prayer, and then we begin our program today. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for bringing us to this place as we continue our discussion on this very important matter of touch and touching. We pray your guidance. We pray your inspiration, that all that is said and done, and even from the questions that have been asked, that you will guide in the responses, so that at the end we will hear, "Thus saith the Lord." Thank you for the panel. Be with each member of the panel. Be with those online who have come and joined us, and those who are here at Mongdo. And we pray that all will work together for good, and your name will be glorified. This being our prayer in Jesus' name, amen. Well, welcome to Mongdor, right here live at the Industrial Lane, Champlain, as we continue our discussion on keeping in touch. It's a very touchy and a sensitive discussion in which we all will be engaged for the next few moments. Once again, I want to introduce to you the panel of eminent scholars, if I may say so, but individuals who are professional in their own right who will help us in our discourse for this afternoon. Seated at my far right is Dr. Sandra Devines. She is a Sandra Reed. What did I say? I know of a Sandra Devines. I do beg your pardon, but she's not here today. So in her place is Sandra Reed, Dr. Sandra Reed, to be precise. She is senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies, and she works in the Department of Medicine. We are happy to have you, Dr. Sandra Reed. Got it this time. Next to her is Pastor Leslie Moses. Can't get that wrong. A family life educator of over 20 plus years of experience. And we are delighted that he could be a part of us. He's also the family life ministries coordinator, director, whichever you prefer. But he is doing an excellent job in the department, and we're happy to have Pastor Leslie Moses join us in this discussion. Of course, he is seated next to, this time it is Myrna Riley Devines. I got that one right. And she is currently serving in the Department of Human Resource, the Vice President, to be precise, of the Human Resource Department at the University of the Southern Caribbean. And finally, Dr. Oscar Ocho. He is not the dean, but the director of the school, of the UWI School of Nursing. And we are happy to have all of you sit on this panel. And I am tempted and I'm encouraged and inspired to go straight to Pastor Leslie Moses for this first question. And Pastor Moses, as we talk about touching, I guess we all would want to be touched. I guess all of us like to touch. But could you briefly tell us, from your experience, what are the benefits of touching?
There are many benefits to touching, and I would start from touching from the very infant stage. Children are soothed when they are touched. I understand that there are cases even where children who are not touched because they are institutionalized may not survive because touching is life-giving. I would also suggest that touching sends various messages. So if we're upset with someone, we try to distance ourselves from them. When we touch, we are saying you're okay, and as far as I'm concerned, things are good with us. But there's another very significant aspect of touching, and that is touching lends toward deepening intimacy between significant others. And I have to qualify significant others in this context, because from our perspective, we are referring to a husband who is a male genetic male, and a wife who is a genetic female. So touching is a form of deepening intimacy. It lends to deepening intimacy. And of course, if a married couple aren't touching each other, I think on the last occasion I alluded to people sleeping on a bed and there's barbed wire in between the both of them. If they are not doing that, then that speaks significantly to what's happening in the marriage. Finally, I think touching says, in uncertain terms, that we are alive and well and kicking. People who are healthy emotionally and psychologically want to be touched. That is why when you see somebody, you find some way to connect with them, with a hug, with a handshake, with a kiss. All of these are ways in which we touch.
Beautiful. Dr. Reed, what is a good definition of inappropriate touching, and what are some of the indicators of inappropriate touching?
Inappropriate touch occurs when someone touches with a sexual intent that is unwanted. It can occur directly, as in when someone deliberately touches what is considered a sexual part of the body, but it can also occur indirectly, in that one may touch a more neutral part of the body, like the shoulder or the hand, but there is a certain quality to that touch. It's a lingering touch, or it might be accompanied by a certain look or a certain verbal expression that makes it an inappropriate touch. Inappropriate touch can also occur indirectly if someone asks you to touch them in a sexual manner, unwillingly. I guess the bottom line is inappropriate touch occurs when its intent is sexual, when it's unwanted, when it violates the boundaries of the individual, thereby making them feel uncomfortable.
It is called inappropriate touching. Why is inappropriate touching inappropriate?
Pastor Moses mentioned the fact that appropriate touching is healthy. It nurtures and it leads to an emotionally comfortable position. Inappropriate touch, on the other hand, is associated with dysfunction. Inappropriate touch can have very detrimental mental and emotional consequences. And these can range from simply feeling ashamed or guilty to feelings of anger and depression and anxiety. And if severe enough, inappropriate touch can actually destroy an individual's capacity to have normal, healthy relationships. And if perchance the victim happens to be a child who is powerless, who is trusting, and who is innocent, the damage that is done can be severely detrimental.
Can inappropriate touching be subjective?
No. And I answer no cautiously. We've already given the definition of an inappropriate touch, and there is no subjectivity about that. It's sexual in intent, it's unwanted, it violates the boundaries, and it makes the person uncomfortable. However, there are situations where the touchee, and I put it that way, the person who is being touched, the touchee as opposed to the toucher, may have psychological problems. And it's so interesting because it's almost like a recurring pattern. Because if you have been a victim of inappropriate touch, your capacity to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate touch becomes blurred. And it, in fact, may be an appropriate touch which is interpreted in an inappropriate way. That's the only element of subjectivity that occurs if the person who is receiving the touch themselves have psychological problems.
Beautiful, beautiful. Mrs. Mona Riley Devines, can an inappropriate touch be misinterpreted? Can an appropriate touch be misinterpreted as an inappropriate touch?
Yes, it can. But to look at that, maybe it's important to look at the different categories of touch. And there's functional professional touch, such as a doctor examining a patient, a barber attending to a customer. And then there's the social polite touch, and that relates to strangers' greeting, such as a handshake, etc. And then there's a friendship warmth touch that occurs between friends. You may have hug, you may have a kiss on the cheek, etc. And then there's the love intimacy touch, that category of touch. And that occurs between persons who are involved in relationship. And then there's the social arousal touch. Of course, one's culture leads to how one interprets touch. So, for instance, if we look at the Chinese culture, if we're looking at a boss to an employee, it's hands-off. Usually, a Chinese employee, it's not appropriate for a boss to touch an employee, etc. Whereas if you look within our...
when you say it's inappropriate, touch any part.
Touch anywhere.
At all, right.
And I will give you an example. There is this situation where a Chinese accountant was employed in the United States of America. Now, they were working on a project, and the boss's approach, usually to convey affirmation for persons doing a good job, is just to put a hand on the shoulder, affirming the person's worth, etc. He did that a couple of times. Each time he went to check on the progress of the employee, he did that. And after 2 weeks, she resigned her job because to her, it was inappropriate. To him, it was just my affirming the work that this person is doing. Now, we look at the, if people feel that they're not in control of the relationship situation, so it's difficult for me to tell you that how you're touching me creates a negative feeling within me, then the option is let me get out of this situation as quickly as possible. So because of one's cultural, the cultural context and how we interpret touch in the cultural context, then what is appropriate for one culture may not be appropriate for another culture. The friendship warmth category is a category that is usually most misinterpreted because a hug to one person may send signals of sexual or love intimacy when it was basically just conveying warmth. And again, it comes back to the culture, how you interpret it. So yes, an appropriate touch may be interpreted as inappropriate.
Even with respect to the hug and the other extensions of touching, is there a manual that we ought to follow? Because some people may think, well, I don't want to hug anybody, and some people may hug in a particular way that may give a wrong impression.
All right, there isn't really a manual to follow, but what is recommended is that your hugs should not be tight and your hugs should not be lingering, because usually I'm a person who likes to hug. I hug everybody, and most people who know me know that. I am a physical person, right? But you have to also be able to recognize people's reaction. So if you attempt to hug someone and the person pulls away, then that's a signal that, hey, look, the person is not necessarily appreciative of the hug. Or accepting, I should say. Maybe accepting is the better word as well. But the other thing that also affects that is what we call oculesics. That is the eye communicating with the eye and the messages that the eye. So if you're touching someone and the message that comes from your eye says something else, then it can send a different message.
Have mercy. Pastor Moses, I want to engage you as we continue in this aspect, because in the Trinidad culture, men bonks, they shake hands, we hold one another, we touch the shoulder, which in some regard, or most regard, is deemed as appropriate. Can any of the above become inappropriate?
Of course, and I think Minna Riley Devines, got it right? Yes. Alluded to it. I think the body language, the message that one derives from the body language will say in large measure whether or not the intent is appropriate or inappropriate. I would also suggest, and this also coming from her, well, from Dr. Reed, that I should be the one to determine how far or to what extent you touch me. So my own boundaries will, to a large degree, determine what I would allow. Of course, a hug could be misconstrued to suggest inappropriateness. How so? If the hug is, if the proximity between bodies are extremely close, number one, and number two, if the hug is lingering. A hug usually for persons within casual relationships would last for a few seconds, 2-3 seconds the most. But if you're hugging somebody, whether male or female, and that person is holding on, unless they are experiencing some measure of distress, if they are holding on and lingering, and they are, enjoying the moment and trying to get more out of it than is really there, then that would suggest that indeed is leading toward inappropriateness.
Would you also agree that sometimes it depends on who is doing the touching? Because you may not want a particular person to touch you for obvious reasons. And once they start touching you, you know they have ulterior motive.
Yeah, I suppose so. And the thing is, if you know somebody has a significant liking for you, so you are the pastor of this church, and there is a particular woman who's giving you messages,
Have mercy.
messages, have mercy indeed.
Have mercy.
And that sister is coming for a hug. Every time you walk through the door, then that is serious business. And so you need to deal with that. And I have had the occasion to kind of pull back from some of those kinds of overtures because I know the intent is not noble.
Okay. Well, he is not here for cosmetic value. He may have been silent for the past few moments, but we want to engage Dr. Ocho. Would you agree that males do not need to be touched as much as females?
No, I disagree. In fact, Hagley says that when it comes to intimacy, women want conversation, but men want sex. Sex does not occur in the absence of touch. And,
You're sure about that?
well, it shouldn't happen except it's immaculate conception, of course. But when we are speaking about touch for men, one of the issues that we have to be concerned about is that men want to differentiate between a social touch and an erotic touch. Men want to be touched because it gives them a sense of worth and belonging. And very often we take it for granted that men, because of their exterior, their stiff and starched exterior, are unsociable. But no matter how unsociable a man may appear, he wants to still feel a sense of belonging and being wanted. And touch is one of the ways that you demonstrate how he feels about himself.
Yes, but in our culture, it is more acceptable for a woman to verbalize her need for touch than for a man to do that. If a man should do that now, would you consider him strange?
You're right from a social perspective, because women, it is easier for them to express themselves. Men, on the other hand, there are certain things that are taken for granted. So that my cue is, if I get close to you, it is an indication that I want you to remain close to me. The challenge we have sometimes is that some women are quick to say, how you behaving, so I know where I want you know. So that there is an overt expression, especially when that man wants to be touched. And that's why, even in a church setting, we need to help men to recognize that even when they are suffering deficiencies of being touched, it does not mean that they now have to be overt in trying to reach out to the point that they become offensive in trying to touch everyone.
Okay, but I want to engage you a little longer. When you say touch for a man, what are you talking to? Because for a woman, it means I could hug. I want a hug. Women tell you, I want a hug. What do men tell you?
Right. The men generally may not tell you,
They want a hug?
I want a hug. But men, it's easier for the men to reach out for a hug. Or for touch for a lot of men is about a kiss.
Say that again?
It's about a kiss.
A kiss.
K-I-S-S.
You all heard that, right?
You see, because very often touch, we believe, is just about hand reaching out to a part of the body. But the mouth for a male is an erogenous zone. And therefore, when a man may not even express that I want to be loved or I want to be touched, he will demonstrate it by even a platonic kiss in a platonic relationship. Within a family relationship, it will be an expression that I want to move further within the context of this conjugal family relationship.
Wow, tell you. Are there any men in the house here? Please listen. Let's go back to Sandra Reed, Dr. Sandra Reed. What is your definition, or what is the definition of sexual harassment?
Sexual harassment is one form of inappropriate touch. So if you would allow me, I'd like to go back to those hallmark features of inappropriate touch. It has a sexual intent, it's unwanted, it violates boundaries, and it makes the persons uncomfortable. Now that can occur in multiple contexts. So you can have inappropriate touch between a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and each of these contexts has a legal term. So when it's between a boyfriend and a girlfriend, we call it sexual assault. It can occur between a teacher and a child. We call that child sexual abuse. Unfortunately, it can occur between a parent and a child. We call that incest. But when it occurs in the workplace, we call that sexual harassment. So sexual harassment then is when there is unwanted sexual advances, sexual behavior, even verbally, where the employee feels uncomfortable, and the person perpetuating the sexual harassment could be an employer or a co-worker. It could be anybody in the workplace, all right? But the boundaries are violated, the individual feels uncomfortable, it interferes with work performance. And in addition, not always, but often, the sexual demands become the basis of either employment or promotion or some aspect of the work-related functioning.
Just to be sure that I understand what you've just said in terms of the different locations. Is it that sexual harassment at home is termed sexual abuse? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, I'm saying inappropriate touch in different contexts have different labels.
Good.
So sexual harassment speaks of the workplace.
Good.
But the principle is the same
Right.
as sexual abuse.
Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. Sexual abuse is a global challenge today. What are the current statistics as it relate to Trinidad and Tobago? What are they saying regarding sexual abuse?
Unfortunately, we don't have any concrete statistics because the surveys have not been done. But there was one small study that was done that looked at adults and inquired of them whether they had had a history of child sexual abuse when they were children. And approximately 12% of the small group of persons, I think it was about 200 persons were interviewed, about 12% of them said yes, they had been sexually molested as children. I would take that 12% as a conservative estimate. Certainly in my practice as a psychiatrist, I see many, many, many individuals who report a history of child sexual abuse. If we look at what has been happening recently, there have been an increasing number of reports to the police, and these have been in the media, but an increasing number of reports of child sexual abuse. Whether that represents an increasing rate of abuse, or whether it is that people are now coming forward to report, because I have been actively involved in the Break the Silence project, which aims to break the silence and have people talk about child sexual abuse. But we're not sure whether it represents an actual increase or people coming forward. But I think what the take-home point here would be is that child sexual abuse is common in our society. It is common. And because of that, it is imperative that parents, teachers, young people, church officials become aware of this phenomenon and equip themselves so that we can protect young people from sexual abuse.
How do you, or what do you say to a child who believes he is being sexually abused at home, but wants to tell, but is afraid to tell because it's home? What do you say to that child?
Okay. That's a difficult question to answer, really, because I would like to take a more preventative stance on a question like that. I think it is absolutely important for parents to equip their children to deal with any instance of inappropriate touch or sexual abuse that occurs. And that starts with open communication. Parents have to be able to speak to their children about sexual issues. And there is no age, most parents do that when children are older. We did a study on the campus of the University of the West Indies, asking young men and young women who were students on the campus, so these are young adults, how did you learn about sex and when did you learn about sex? The females told us that they learned from books, from their peers, from Johnson & Johnson's. Those are the women who are older in the audience would know that Johnson & Johnson would go to the schools and talk about sex and menstruation and those things. And the women learned about these things around the age of 18, or around the time that the period started. The men, on the other hand, the young men, learned about sex from TV, from the internet, from pornography, and from their peers. There was no adult input into their sex education. This is what we do not want. We want to start educating our children from very, very early. And I emphasize that sex education is not about putting your child to sit down across the table from you and bringing out a book or bringing out a manual. Sex education is simply about opening up the communication and talking casually about sex. One of the first things you could start with when a child is very, very young is the names of the parts of the body.
The correct names too.
Correct names. Because when you give them all of these little jokey fancy names, what you are basically communicating to children is that these are parts of your body to be ashamed of, not to be spoken of. And when you do that, you actually hinder communication. So you start by using the proper names for the body parts. And as your child grows, you talk more and more as is appropriate for the child's age. By the time a child reaches 3 or 4 before starting school, they should have a very clear idea as to what is good touch and bad touch. But your question spoke of when a child is being abused and is scared to tell. Children are frequently scared to tell because parents and adults don't believe them. I actually was going to challenge you, but you changed your question because you said when a child feels he is being abused. But children don't feel they're being abused. Children are abused. You know, and it's very, very painful for a child to be violated in that manner and then have your parents say, I don't believe you, or you're telling an untruth, or, you know, stop that lying.
Or sometimes now the culture, sometimes they are sworn to secrecy or threatened into secrecy.
That's right. And these are the things that parents teach children. If someone were to touch you inappropriately, they may want to scare you, but you can come to me because I will believe you and I will protect you.
Okay. Let's get to Muna Riley Devines. Sexual intimacy can be used appropriately as well as inappropriately. Do you agree? Would you care to elaborate? I see you smile.
Yes. We'll talk about sexual intimacy between persons in a relationship, husband, wife, etc. but there's a time and there's a place for everything. And you know, sometimes you have husbands and wives working together in the workplace. The workplace is not some place that you take your sexual intimacy. When you get into the organization, you're one employee to another employee, not husband and wife. And you save that from when you get out of it. There are times when people take their sexual intimacy to open public places, believe it or not, places like the beach, etc. But you have to, and let me tell you something, sexual intimacy is a God-given gift. It is something to be valued. It is something to be cherished. It is something to be respected. It is not something, I know society and the television has given a different meaning to it. Do it where you want, when you want, before who you want. But that's not God's ideal. And it means, therefore, that we have to ensure that the context in which we relate to each other at a sexual intimacy level, that is important and that's preserved.
Good, thank you. Dr. Ochan, this will be our final questions before we engage the audience, whether the live audience or the online audience. Can inappropriate touching affect one's sexuality, or at least one's understanding of his sexuality?
Yes, because touching, there is a psychological dimension to this physical entity that we call touch. And sometimes it is where the person is touched causes stimulation of one's erogenous zones.
Could you, that's the second time you're using that word.
Yes.
Could you break it down for us, please?
All right.
For lay people like myself.
Right, good. And when within each one of us as individuals, we have zones that are considered erotic or associated with sexual feelings of intimacy, which causes a certain level of excitement to move from just the touch to consummation or intercourse. And for some individuals, depending on who is doing the touch and depending on where the touch is, going along with that, the sounds, the ums, the ahs, the eye contacts, they provide the person who is being touched, and I'll use Dr. Reed's term, the touchy, with a message that sometimes could confuse you. So in our work with, for example, homosexuals, in a lot of instances, it started off with innocent games of touch, where it was just a case of showing your penis. It was just a case of just being in the same place, let's say having a bath. But you're not thinking of anything, but then you may be touched, maybe on the buttocks, just a slight touch. And sometimes there is that electricity, as we would say, that connectivity. And after a while, individuals may lose their inhibitions. And that now begins to be seen as normal. And after it becomes so normal, then it skews your concept of how God ordained sexual intimacy within the context of marriage, but also within the context of Adam and Eve.
Beautiful. Just have one more question based on what you just said, and maybe this is for the entire panel to respond to. Coming back to what you just said about the oohs and the ahs, someone here or someone may have been touched inappropriately, but the inappropriate touch may have produced the oohs and the ahs. And as such, they may feel complicit. They may feel that they played a part in the inappropriate touch, and they feel guilty. How do you counsel such a one?
That, Pastor Riley, is a very important part of helping a person recover from sexual assault, whether it be child sexual abuse or rape. Because as Dr. Ocho is saying, our bodies were created that if certain areas are touched, you feel sexual pleasure. You could have absolutely no desire, but the body responds because that's how we were created. And that makes an individual feel, like you said, that they were responsible or they wanted it. And it is a source of great distress to victims. So people need to be reassured that even if your body responded, that does not make you complicit. That does not make you responsible. And it works the same way with the sexuality and the sexual orientation. If a young boy is sexually abused by a male, he may experience some amount of sexual pleasure that he's not looking for, that he's not seeking. But because he feels the pleasure, he believes he's now of a homosexual orientation. And he therefore now adapts and adjusts to the stereotype of a homosexual, and he labels himself homosexual. Whereas if he had been counseled to appreciate that what he felt is not an expression of his sexuality, but simply an expression of his body responding to a touch, then he would probably not think that he would be of that orientation.
May I add that the whole matter of sexual education, teaching our youths, teaching our children, teaching adults what is appropriate and inappropriate would help to delink pleasure, I was saying pleasure, from inappropriate touching. It may not be able to delink it in the sense that they are occurring together, but it may help in terms of the person realizing, even though this is pleasure, I felt pleasure, it is inappropriate, or it came via the inappropriate route.
And I think that's why it's important that we use a preventative approach to this thing, because very often many of our daughters find themselves being confused because they have not known what it is to be embraced by a father with no strings attached. So when another male shows what they interpret to be affection, by extension, they are interpreting that response to mean I have to offer some level of sexual pleasure. And that has to also be for our sons. In fact, in my own research for my thesis, one of the things that some of these married men were saying is that we wished that we had more opportunity to interact and learn and play and feel with our fathers, because we never knew that our fathers loved us. Because they didn't know what it is to be touched by a father, to understand that men do touch with no strings attached.
Additionally, one of the things that especially our younger persons need to understand is that sexual feelings are normal. Because once you get into the stage of puberty, etc., you will have sexual feelings, and there's nothing wrong with having sexual feelings. It's about helping persons to be able to manage the sexual feelings and what you do with the feelings when you get with the feelings. So there's nothing, because it's a part of your whole biological makeup.
Beautiful. You have been looking and you have been part of Keeping in Touch. And in our next segment, we will look at the questions that the audience, those online and those at Mongdo, would want to ask. We take a break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Keeping in Touch. And as we discuss on the subject of keeping in touch, we are looking at touching and inappropriate touching. Once again on the panel is Dr. Sandra Reed. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Medicine at the University of the West Indies. Next to her is Pastor Leslie Moses, Family Life Educator and Family Life Ministries Director. Next to him is Mrs. Myrna Riley Devines, Vice President of the Human Resource Department at the University of the Southern Caribbean, also known affectionately as a motivational speaker of many parts and of wide experience. And next to her is Dr. Oscar Ocho, Director of the School of Nursing at the University of the West Indies. We have a question from our local audience, and we will want to invite you, please, to direct the question or identify the person to whom you would want the question to be directed.
I didn't exactly have a question to the thing posed. Something I heard when I walked in just now, earlier, and I wanted to ask, make an assertion towards a book, something counseling, word. I wanted to ask the panel if anybody ever read Dr. Patricia Love and Dr. Bo Johnson's book, Enmeshed Parents. I did an extensive thing on it when I was younger, even in the Baldwin's time, right? It's about trauma people. You get a lot out of it. I gave one to the library. Somebody stole it.
Okay.
I got back one after. I used to be at a reader society from outside. And I sort of do like how you all do counseling. I helped a lot of people with that book. Patricia Love and Bo Johnson, Enmeshed Parents. This is saying trauma people.
But do you have a specific question, though?
No, not as yet.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if they would have read it. I guess it's for information. Could another person approach the microphone?
My name is Andre Romero. I am from the New Hope Prison Ministry, Seventh-day Adventist umbrella. My question is Pastor Leslie Moses. Why I am directing this to you, I feel you will be able more likely to answer this directly. I'm a person who have been privileged to travel. And whilst traveling, different countries have different greeting methods. Our culture in Trinidad, we may look at something inappropriate, but that culture to them is appropriate. For example, I've been to Africa, Kenya, I've been to Egypt. You know, these Islam countries, that's totally no where greeting and touching is concerned. But Christian country like Ethiopia, their greeting now is 89 tribes. And I'm an artist, I teach, I go, NGO hire me to go to different remote tribes to teach arts and craft and these things. So my question, for example, when a person comes to you now and they hug you and they greet you with a kiss, how will you shun that person? For example, now there's a next tribe, now when you go and you visit them, their greeting is that they hold you and they kiss you.
Stay to the mic.
They kiss you on your hand. And when they kiss you on your hand, they take your hand, or you have to put back your hand to kiss them. And some of other tribe greeting now is that, especially if you are from the church,
So
they give you about 3 different kisses.
all right.
How will you respond to that now? Because even when you go to America,
I think we got a question.
when you go to America now, it's bouncing and it's
Right.
5. How will you respond to these kind of greetings?
Beautiful. Thank you.
Very
Thank
good
you.
question.
Thank
Very
you.
good.
That's my question.
Yes, very good question. I think Mrs. Riley Devines alluded to the fact that touching to a large degree is cultural. What we do in Trinidad will certainly not be done in Alaska. And what is done in Africa, among the tribes that you referred to, will not be done in Trinidad. If another man kisses another man in this culture, the man who is being kissed, the kissee, will wonder, what in the world is happening here? You know? So we have to become culturally sensitive when we travel. So they say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Of course, there has to be a line drawn too, because in some communities and in some cultures, the touch could be uncomfortable and inappropriate to you. And so if it is, then you have to, with good wisdom, try to maintain your boundaries without offending the toucher.
Beautiful. Can I get a next question, please?
I've had experiences through the years in church.
To whom are you directing the question?
Pardon?
To whom are you directing the question?
I'm trying to tell any of the four except you, but
Okay.
I'm not ruling you out exclusively, right? Through the years as a Christian Adventist,
Can you keep on the microphone? Yeah. Say the microphone, yes.
I've had experiences where I'm shocked up maybe a year ago or less. I've had male and female as well deliberately bounce into me. I could sense that, right? At the front of me. I have had people, male and female, hug me and have gotten, as we used to say in the 70s, the vibes. I know this is no accident. Question. I have tolerated it because as a Christian, I don't like the idea of insulting and hurting people. Did I deal with them appropriately?
Right, so you got the vibes. What do you do when you get the vibes? Yes.
No,
I want to re-emphasize the vibes was my sensing that they were
Yes.
deliberately being
Yes, I mean,
mischievous.
We got that.
now,
As long as you didn't return the vibes.
now, a lot of us are laughing, but to the person asking the question, perception is reality. And what is important here is an individual who in his mind, he is interpreting a particular behavior when the person who may be hugging may have had no intent. However, because he is feeling the vibe, it is important that he express his feelings at that particular time. In fact, there are some persons who will tell you, if you are going to be hugged, it's important to keep one hand in front of your chest so that one hand could reach out to embrace the person's back and the other will be kept in front of you so that the individual recognizes you cannot enter too closely into my personal space. But I think more importantly, we have to be careful that sometimes we are not reading something that doesn't exist to the point that we become uncomfortable in even being social.
And in addition to that, it's quite okay to say to persons, because if someone hugs you and it makes you feel uncomfortable, it's quite okay to say to the person, while I appreciate your hug, it makes me feel a bit uncomfortable, and therefore maybe I'd appreciate another form of greeting. So it's quite okay to say that. What's important is to establish that communication. It's not that you're putting the person down, but it's very important to express, because you're tolerating it, so to speak. It's building up the negative feelings that's there in your subconscious or otherwise. And if it's not dealt with, it's going to come out at some point. And therefore, it's important that you can say to the person that this interaction makes me feel uncomfortable.
But
Okay.
Doctor, it may have just been it could have been a perfect sort of stranger in the sense that it's a brethren that I'm not familiar with, but in our church setting, well, you say he or she is an Adventist, so, you know, so it's not that you will say, well, you feel that sometime after everything is over, I'm going to tell this person this. My attitude is a first time, one time thing, just leave it alone. Just leave it alone. So
Okay.
I'm a thing. But if you permit me just to talk
If it's another question, we'll have to wait for another round. We'll want it. Yeah. Just give us, we'll come back to you. All right, let's go.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. To Dr. Ocho first. Now, you were saying, you made mention about man kissing, K-I-S, right? And more or less, you said it was like an erogenous zone, right? And we were discussing in the back there saying, well, you said it's like saying want to go more. At one point, it had a mention that, when a man kisses, he's also indicating that he wants to go more.
When you say kissing, you mean kissing a woman?
Well, but he also made mention of like children, but we want a link whereby how could we look at that as a father, in kissing the children, a link that the children could understand that this is just, just parental love, So that's one question, and the other question is, I think this one would go out, but I think Pastor Moses may have something on that. You also mentioned, there was made mention during the conversation or the contributions that inappropriate touching leads to harassment, or it can be like a harassment. What measures or what does the church have in place to help individuals deal with a situation when it comes in that manner? And also to the last person, I would tell that person, I'm not of like mind, sorry.
Okay. Right, so the first question, parental limitations.
Let me start with the second part of the question first. One of the issues I raised was that we needed to use a preventative approach, and fathers should embrace and touch their daughters so that they can associate being touched with no strings attached. When I spoke about kiss, I spoke about it not in the platonic sense. And when we speak about platonic, we are speaking about just the friendship. So that I may see a sister and we greet with a holy kiss. Maybe a kiss on the cheek, maybe a kiss on the forehead. Within the context of a family, a husband and wife, there would be times when a kiss on the forehead will demonstrate, I love you, baby. I care for you, baby. But then there would be the kiss that is associated with life support. Which often is a precursor to coitus. It was in that particular context I was speaking about how touch within the context of that relationship is a precursor to that heightened intimacy. Any father who feels erotic when touching his daughter needs to have an appointment with Dr. Reed.
Dr. Reed, you want to respond? Yes.
All right. I would like to put a different twist on that, because let me share with you some of the things we found, we meaning our research group, Break the Silence research group. Let me share some of the things we found when we went into communities. We went into communities to try to understand why child sexual abuse occurs. What is it about our culture? What is it about our people that makes this behavior so common? And one of the things that we found, and we didn't do numbers, so I can't tell you how common it is, but it is something that we found, is that men and women, fathers and mothers, measure the sexual readiness of their children by their physical development. So as soon as a child enters puberty and starts to develop breasts, in the case of the girl, or starts to menstruate, the father and the mother and the neighbors and the teachers tend to believe that they are sexually ready, and that is inaccurate. But because of that, fathers have a tendency to stop hugging their children, their daughters, once they start to develop, for the same reasons that Dr. Ocho is sharing. Maybe they feel that they may get erotic feelings. Maybe they are uncomfortable because of this cultural belief that once a young girl starts to mature, she's sexually ready. But I would like to encourage fathers, and we're talking about fathers not in the category that Dr. Ocho last spoke about, the ones who get erotic feelings. You really do need help, and that's not a joke. You really should seek help. But for those of you who continue to have nice fatherly feelings towards your daughters, please don't stop hugging them because they have started to develop, because that is how they learn the healthy touch. Okay? So don't be afraid of yourselves once you know your motives are pure.
Beautiful. His second question has to do with what measures does the church have in place for someone who is sexually harassed or believes he is sexually harassed or she is sexually harassed.
Of course, the church, and when we talk about sexual harassment, we're talking about sexual harassment in the church place or the workplace.
I'm supposing it meant first of all in the church place.
So sexual harassment is related to the workplace. Sexual abuse would be related to the church place.
Right, that's right.
If in any of these environments an individual feels that he or she is harassed, especially in the workplace, one can lose his job or her job for harassing someone else. Of course, there are processes by which you will, do your investigation and be sure that somebody isn't lying or somebody isn't concocting a story, right? So there are penalties for sexual harassment on the workplace, and the church is very, very strict as far as that is concerned. And the understanding is, if it is perceived to be happening, it should be reported to the HR person. And in this case, at the university, it would be our fellow panelists. If it is happening in the church, where we're talking about sexual abuse or the potential for sexual abuse, that too should be reported. I remember a horror story of a woman who her husband had gone overseas. And she said to me, people were approaching her, including married men. So I said to her, then let's talk to it. And when it happens again, inform whoever, I'm going to report it. She returned several weeks later to say that was the end of all the approaches and overtures. So that if it's happening, whether at work or at school or at church, it should be reported.
And just to add to that, our organization, in terms of the church organization, has a sexual harassment policy. And every organization should have a sexual harassment policy, and persons should be aware of this. And one of the things that employees are told is that if someone approaches you, whether it's a touch, but it's unwelcome, the action is unwelcome, what you need to say is categorically, no, I do not appreciate that. Because keeping silent does not say anything. And it's very important that people recognize that you have a right to say that I do not appreciate you touching me this way. I do not appreciate, because it's not just sexual harassment, it's not just about touching. It's about what you say to the person. And as a matter of fact, it's not even about you, because you can touch somebody's clothes, somebody's clothing, and under the law, you can be deemed as sexually harassing them. And therefore, we have to understand that you can make a comment about somebody's makeup in terms of their physical makeup, and it can be deemed as sexual harassment. And therefore, it's very important for persons to understand that you can say categorically, stop, no, I do not appreciate what you're saying or what you're doing, because sometimes people make jokes in the organization that they believe it's okay, but it's offensive to the person on the receiving end. And therefore, if you do not let people, and even some of the things that we send via email can be seen as sexual harassment. And people don't understand that. You have these things and you forward them all over the place. And to someone receiving it, it can be deemed as sexual harassment. And so what's important is you sharing that you do not appreciate it and you request the person to stop. If after requesting the person to stop, the person continues, then that is going to be deemed as harassing.
But I think an important part of the question was, and I think I need the information, is for those persons who do not feel empowered to report, are there support systems, formalized support systems, where this person can receive any kind of help from the church?
Okay, one of the things is that sometimes persons do not feel brave enough to report it themselves. It's quite okay to share it with someone else, and someone else can report it on your behalf. So that can happen as well. But there are also counseling situations in counseling services available where persons in organizations, you can have the employee assistance program, and you can refer persons, and because sometimes organizations have counseling services, and persons may feel that I don't want to share this information with someone else within the organization. And so you can have external resources available to that person. And under the employee assistance program, the organization, yes, the organization is built, but the organization, because it's confidential, the organization does not know who the person. So for instance, the billing goes to finance, and yes, it's coming from this counselor, but finance will not know that Oscar Ocho went to see this counselor and this is what is being billed for. Basically, what's on it is a code, and only the counselor knows what that code means. And so that person's privacy is protected.
Beautiful. We have a question from Marval, and this is directed to Dr. Reed. Is there any correlation between early sexual abuse and what is considered as deviant sexual behavior? And we have a few minutes before we begin to wind up.
Okay. The short answer to that question is yes. The long answer can take the rest of today into tomorrow. Okay? But let's try to understand this. A victim of child sexual abuse is violated. They are violated, and there are a lot of psychological and emotional consequences. Low self-esteem, a distorted self-image, and a distorted perception of sex. They become very sexualized. So you find that even children who are sexually abused, those are the children who go to school and behave in a sexually inappropriate manner. Oftentimes they are labeled as the bad children, but in fact they are the victims who are simply acting out the abusive experiences they have endured. Without help, these things grow into adulthood, and adult victims of child sexual abuse generally tend to be either so sexualized that they could become promiscuous, or so afraid of intimacy that they actually decide to live a solo life with absolutely depriving themselves of the advantage of appropriate touch and appropriate relationships. In addition, you find that child sexual abuse is associated with other, as she described it, deviant behaviors. We've talked about the association with impaired sexual orientation, and almost all of the sexually deviant behaviors you can think of are more likely in persons who have been victims.
Okay, we just have two more questions from the audience, the live audience. And we have a few questions from online. We're not sure if we could answer all of them. So we're asking you to go straight to the microphone, be as brief as you can, and direct the question to the person.
Good afternoon again. My question is directed to Miss Sandra. Based on a child who has been sexually molested, say by her father, it's understood that, as the young lady grows up in life, it's understood that certain demonic spirits follows that person throughout their life, right? My question is, can somebody ever feel completely normal again who that has happened to? Or even though they might be a Christian, can they feel normal again? Because most times you feel like as if there's a mess in your life. Can you ever feel normal again?
That's an excellent question, because just the way the young lady phrased it speaks to the pervasive pain and incompleteness that a person who is a victim of child sexual abuse experiences. What I can say as a professional myself, no amount of counseling ever takes away that feeling of emptiness. I use the word emptiness because that's the word that most victims would use to describe how they feel. Not sadness, not depression, but emptiness. And from interacting with these individuals, I have come to believe, and I truly believe, that it is only through relationship with God that you can get that sense of completeness, because it is through Him that we feel complete. So psychological counseling, psychiatric intervention, they do help. They help you deal with depression when it comes, with anxiety, with healthier relating. But when it comes to that absolute healing, it is through relationship with Christ.
And before we take the next question, Pastor, I'm not sure I heard correctly, but I thought I heard that once one is abused as a child, demonic spirits follow you. And I just want to correct that. And that is a view, but as a pastor who also works in the mental health realm, that isn't so, right? It is not supported in Scripture, and certainly people can misinterpret feelings and thoughts to suggest that they are coming from demons. Sometimes it's really the demon deep down inside, another demon from somewhere else. So we just want to ensure that there is this understanding that demons don't attend to you forever thereafter, after a bout of sexual abuse.
Okay.
Good afternoon, panel. I have two questions, one directed to Dr. Reed. I know your focus is on touch, but what about a father that flashes or exposes himself to his daughter? How would you advise a child on that? And also, up to what age is it appropriate for a father to beat his daughter?
Beg your pardon, could you repeat that last? Up to what age, what?
Is it appropriate or acceptable for a father to beat his daughter?
You dropped your voice in the last few words.
To bathe his daughter.
Oh, bathe. Okay.
Okay, the first question had to do with flashing. I guess all of you know what flashing is, okay? Okay. The definition of child sexual abuse is a broad one. It does not only include inappropriate touch, it includes anything of a sexual nature, including flashing or exposing one's genitals to someone else, or inviting somebody to look at you, or peeping at somebody, even something like inviting somebody to read sexual literature with you or to watch pornography with you, something on the phone, asking to record pictures of somebody doing inappropriate acts. All of those are covered by the definition of child sexual abuse. So when we educate our children, we're not only educating them about touch, but we are educating them about these inappropriate sexual interactions as well. And we would treat with them just as we would treat with inappropriate touch. Concerning a father bathing a child, my response to that would be, there is a certain age at which a child can bathe him or herself. And if the father wishes to bathe the child beyond that age, then we'd have to question why.
Very well. And we just have one more question, I believe, before we wrap up. And this is directed to, I suppose, to any member of the panel. What telltale signs should a parent look for to determine whether or not his child is being abused?
Okay, I'll fill the gap. All right, there are many signs. First, there are the obvious physical signs. So we're talking both girls and boys. Remember, boys can be abused too, and it's harder for them to speak out about it because, again, of our culture which teaches that if a boy has an older woman making a move on him, he should feel great, he should feel like a man, but that's not true. Boys feel hurt as well. If you notice that the child is limping, walking with difficulty, has bruises in the genital area, blood on the underwear, those are obvious signs that a child might be abused.
Before you go on, Dr. Reed, are you talking to both male and female, or is this specific?
Male and female.
Okay.
Yes, male and female. You also want to look for some of the behavioral problems. If you notice that a previously well-behaved child suddenly develops temper tantrums, difficult behavior, challenging, rebellious behavior, one should ask why. Children don't just begin to behave badly with no reason. And if that occurs in combination with a child saying, "Mommy, you know, I don't want this man to take me to school anymore," or "Mommy, I don't want to go by Uncle Tom anymore," or "Mommy, I don't want to go by Auntie Suzanne anymore," because women can be abusers too, not as commonly as the men, but it does happen. So we want to listen to what our children say. And then there are the most other psychological symptoms. A child who suddenly becomes very anxious and nervous and afraid, or a child who for no reason is sad and crying and complaining again about not wanting to be in a particular area with a particular person. Those are some of the early telltale signs that a child might be a victim of sexual abuse. And don't forget, if a child becomes sexualized, if you notice your child all of a sudden engaging in behaviors that look like sexual movements or motions, or they suddenly want to come and touch you in a place that is inappropriate, or maybe put their mouth on you in an inappropriate place, they would have learned that somewhere. Speak to them. Ask them about what is happening.
Can I add?
In addition to what Dr. Reed has said as well, you may also have a sudden drop in the child's school performance, which could tell you are the child locking himself or herself away and not wanting to socialize with other persons as well.
And I would like to add, if there's a preoccupation with the genitalia, the penis or the vagina, or for a girl the breasts, a boy the buttocks, that may be an indicator. But I'm hearing as well, Pastor, of situations in schools where boys are approaching other boys sexually and girls are approaching other girls sexually. That may be an indicator too that something is happening. As Dr. Reed said, this wouldn't just come out of the blue. They would have learned it somewhere, and chances are if they didn't learn it on television based on their viewing of pornography or something, and that is abusive, then they would have learned it based on some experience they would have had with somebody else.
But I also think there is also a critical sign. If children are coming home with things on a regular basis that you know they can't afford and you can't afford, and somebody, they tell you a story about, "Oh, sir gave me this," or "this person gave me this." Very often our children are bribed into silence, and sometimes parents are not as vigilant to check on these things. They could be telltale signs. But you also look at a child who suddenly becomes extremely quiet, who was outgoing, and sometimes they begin to become very tearful for no reason. It is giving you clues that something is happening in your child's life that you need to pay attention to.
Well, let's somewhat end on a good note, I suppose. Two persons are courting, and they are displaying some measure of affection between themselves. What advice would you give them in terms of display of intimacy in a public forum? What is an appropriate way of displaying intimacy publicly And let's look at it in the context of the Christian circle. How would you advise? If you had a daughter, or Sister Devines, you do have daughters. If you have a daughter and you'd want to applaud your daughter for displaying intimacy in public, but they are courting, what would you consider to be appropriate?
My greater concern is not the public display. Simply because many of us know how to control our behavior when the lights are on us. And therefore it's very important that we set boundaries as a couple. And let's be real. Courting is a period where we want to be demonstrative about our affection for the one we love. And if we are not careful, if we do not set our boundaries, I usually say to young people, be careful with making the relationship physical. Sometimes our mouths are so filled with different parts of the anatomy that we don't have time to talk. But no, we have to be real. So you want to be able, while you're courting, to speak. And you cannot speak with your mouth filled.
I'm afraid to ask you to break it down for us, but
I need not go further.
Please.
Okay? So, a kiss on the forehead, a kiss on the cheek. There will come a time, and let's be realistic, when it will become mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. One of the things that we have to be careful with is limiting the amount of physical contact. Also, very importantly, in my dealings with young people, sometimes we fail to recognize how we dress gives certain messages. So sometimes a person may not think about anything, but that dress goes straight up to the limbic system, and the penis stands at attention. Because you are human before you are Christian. And it is when these things are happening, you want now to reach out and have prolonged touches. You also need to let the person know what your erogenous zones are and you wish not to be touched. And we got to face reality. What may start off very innocently. And finally, if you know the Holy Spirit leaves at 10 o'clock,
somebody got that. We are still 6:30,
do
so
not
there's still
wait
some chance.
until 9:55. You understand? I like to be practical, because sometimes too many of our persons find themselves in situations because they fail to understand that they have a responsibility for managing how their sexual expressions are dealt with and their feelings as well.
Well, we are still, thankfully, in the context of the church. We have a few minutes before we wrap up, and we are still a way off from 10. I would not want 10 o'clock to reach and something happens. But surely, Pastor Moses, there must be some guidelines as to how an unmarried couple behaves in a church setting, publicly.
Let me answer that, but Dr. Reed wanted to make
Sure.
a contribution.
No,
So
no,
after a
it
contribution,
was just a brief contribution to say that if young people want to do what Dr. Ocho just shared in terms of setting boundaries, they have to turn off the television and stop watching porn. Because once you feed yourself sexually immoral situations, it will be very hard to exercise that control.
Beautiful. Yes, Pastor Moses.
one of the things young people and older people must realize is that the law of diminishing returns says if you do something now and it gives you a certain level of excitement, you would need to do something more to give you more excitement or to maintain that level of excitement. Therefore, it is advisable that when you are courting, you become as aphysical as possible, meaning don't get physical. Once you get started, you will not be able to stop. And so it becomes challenging. Let's be real. Dr. Ocho has been talking about being real. Two persons are courting for 5 years. And they're wondering, you know, what next? What do we do? How do we maintain this level of physical or sexual excitement? And so it has to be that a clear and definite decision has to be made. We will not. And I have to say, you know, there is a prevailing view that everybody's having sex and that everybody is becoming very physical in their relationships. But I'm hearing other voices of adult young people saying to me, I did not. I have not engaged in sexual activity. I have not been involved in heavy petting and the other things that are associated with significant lovemaking and sexual intimacy that would lead to a word that Dr. Ocho used, coitus, sexual engagement. So the caution to me is, the caution that I would give is, don't get physical. Once you do, you will not be able to stop. Then I would suggest, and I'm saying this as I alluded to a point earlier, courtship should not be forever. Courtship should not be forever. If you're courting somebody and you realize that this is not the person for you, break all ties.
Right.
Break off the relationship and look for somebody that you can court, and that courtship should lead, you know, smoothly into marriage, given a reasonable amount of time.
Good.
Some people court for 8, 9 years.
No, that's not possible.
And you know, you realize that that kind of courtship is troublesome and burdensome. So that would be the advice that I would give in relation to that.
All right, well, it's a good way to end, and we want to thank the panel for their sterling and professional advice. You want to put your hands together for the panel? I think they have done excellent. I also want to thank you, our live audience here at Mongdo. Put your hands together for yourselves. Come on, you can do better than that.